During the year preceding the outbreak of the Spanish War, I was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and while my party was in opposition, I had preached with all the fervor and zeal I possessed our duty to intervene in Cuba and to take this opportunity of driving the Spaniard from the Western world. Now that my party had come to power, I felt it incumbent on me, by word and deed, to do all I could to secure the carrying out of the policy in which I so heartily believed. And from the beginning I had determined that if a war came, somehow or the other, I was going to the front. These are the own words of Theodore Roosevelt in his book, The Rough Riders, recounting his experience leading the 1st Volunteer Cavalry during the Spanish-American War. Now, the story of everything that happened before, during, and after their famous charge at the Battle of San Juan Hill is one that I don't really feel is told all that much and remembered too well, but I believe the whole story is still very interesting and worth remembering. Also, I needed another reason to justify buying a Krag Jorgenson. While mostly important for marking a distinct change in American warfare and foreign policy, the Spanish-American War, and particularly the Battle of San Juan Hill, was one of the first U.S. conflicts to be heavily covered by journalists and photographers on the ground, thanks to the rise of sensationalized journalism and new advances in photographic technology. With the end of the American Civil War and the start of the Cuban War for Independence in the late 1860s, the big vacuum cleaner-shaped island in the Caribbean was thrown into a rough political and economic situation. Now, the U.S. had been one of the top importers and exporters to Cuba, and Spain had held political control over the island for centuries. But all of the recent conflict and abolition of the slave trade in the U.S. had devalued exports from Cuba, meaning that both American and Spanish interests were now at risk. For Cubans, independence from Spain and strong economic relations with the U.S. was a very attractive idea, and the freedom movement worked very hard to garner American sympathy and support. One of the biggest advocates for Cuban independence was Emilio Bacardi, owner and heir to his father's rum empire. As head of the company, Emilio was in a perfect position to use his status and reputation as a cover to support the growing Cuban guerrilla army. He was instrumental in the creation of an intel network, as well as supplying rebels with resources like food, money, and of course, rum. And while Coca-Cola wouldn't arrive in Cuba until the 1900s, many revolutionaries created a special cocktail of Bacardi rum, brown sugar, and a splash of water, and they called it the Cuba Libre. Now, since the U.S. was also in the early planning stages for the Panama Canal at the time, good relations between the United States and Cuba were attractive on both ends. And while that would have meant very heavy economic involvement and in some respect control over Cuba, the U.S. was not necessarily interested in political control of the island, at least not directly on paper. The situation in Cuba slowly built until 1895, when Antonio Castillo, the Spanish prime minister at the time, sent troops to Cuba to shut down the growing rebellion that had gone past demonstration and protests to full-on guerrilla warfare. In 1897, Castillo was assassinated by Michel Angiolillo Lombardi, leaving Spain in a very volatile state that couldn't afford to lose Cuba. Over this same time period, the U.S. had repeatedly tried to work things out with Cuba and Spain, with President William McKinley continuously trying to find a peaceful solution that left everyone happy. Spain was not so easily convinced and only promised reform if the rebels gave up, which they were, of course, not willing to do. With things quickly reaching the boiling point, McKinley sent the USS Maine to Havana to provide American support in case things blew up. And they certainly did, starting with the USS Maine itself. On the night of February 15, 1898, the forward powder storage detonated, basically vaporizing the front third of the ship, sinking the rest, and killing over 260 of its 355-man crew. The cause and reason for the Maine's explosion has been a heavily debated topic ever since, with over 6 different investigations being done all the way up to the 2000s, and no concrete conclusion ever being confirmed. What is known is that something blew up and sank the ship, but different investigations have concluded that the cause could have been anything from a spontaneous fire in the coal bunker near the powder storage, or it was an external detonation either from a mine or a planted bomb. Even after using computer modeling, digital reconstruction, and laser scanning on the wreckage and the harbor, we still don't really know for sure what happened. It's also still heavily debated who actually did it. The most obvious culprit, if it was indeed an act of sabotage, would of course be Spain, since they didn't want the US to have a stronger hold on Cuba, but remember that they were in a rough situation themselves at the time, and going to war with the US wouldn't have necessarily been a good idea. You could also argue that some Cubans wouldn't have wanted the US around either, because Sure, there were a large number of Cubans actively seeking American support, but there were also plenty others who just saw the US as a new kind of tyrant to replace the Spanish. Then of course we could also consider that it was a false flag operation. What I'm saying is, did McKinley do 215? Would the US government really sacrifice its own people and blame it on a rival country as an excuse to go to war over a different country with rich economic potential? No, come on, that's crazy talk. The government wouldn't do that. Now, the official story from the Cuban perspective today is that the US did indeed intentionally destroy the US Maine to kickstart a war with Spain, and the memorial in Havana claims that the sailors lost in the explosion were victims sacrificed to imperialist greed in its fervor to seize control of Cuba. When the Operation Northwoods documents were released in 1997, the public had concrete evidence that the CIA had indeed been exploring the use of false flag attacks during the Cold War, and one such idea was blowing up an American naval ship in Guantanamo Bay. Coincidence? I'll let you decide. The loss of the USS Maine was initially ruled an accident, and President McKinley was careful not to immediately jump to conclusions and strike out at Spain, but several different outlets in the American media weren't so careful and began blaming the Spanish almost immediately, leading to massive public outcry. This is one of the earliest examples of what is called yellow journalism, which is basically when the media sensationalizes, exaggerates, or flat out just makes up a headline just to garner interest or attention. It's basically a very early form of clickbait. Many businessmen and politicians were still opposed to war, however, arguing that conflict with Spain wouldn't be in America's best interests, and McKinley continued to encourage a diplomatic solution to the continually growing problems in Cuba. Despite that, more and more people saw war with Spain as essentially inevitable, and about a month and a half after the loss of the USS Maine, McKinley gave in and allowed Congress to send American troops to Cuba. The goal was to support Cuban revolutionaries in gaining independence before things got any worse, or any more countries got involved, which a few different European powers were already trying to chip in on both sides. The Teller Agreement, enacted on April 20th, ensured that the goal of the American involvement in Cuba was not to take control or annex the island to the US, but simply just to get the Spanish out. The common consensus at the time was that Cuba was under oppression from the Spanish, so the US going to war was primarily seen as a humanitarian effort more than a political or economic move. Spain ceased any negotiations or talks of diplomatic solutions on the same day the Teller Agreement went into effect, and US Navy ships were sent to Cuba and stationed on a blockade around the island on April 21st, with war officially being declared on the 25th. While the strength of the US Navy was pretty solid at the time, the Army only had about 24,000 troops in service. The loss of the USS Maine did spur a lot of men to volunteer, but they still needed to be trained, organized, and led. Now, there were several different units that fought in the Spanish-American War, but there is one group of soldiers that has risen to almost legendary status as an icon of American pride, the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, better known as the Rough Riders. And who else could lead such a famed group of warriors than the bull moose himself, Theodore Roosevelt? Now, as I'm sure many of you have heard, old TR was a bit of a legend himself, so let's talk about him for a little bit. Now, Teddy was born into a life of wealth and power and is widely considered to be the first celebrity president. He's often portrayed as the embodiment of American machismo, and he was a huge proponent of American foreign policy. But he wasn't always this bold and brash Chad that we think of, and in fact, he started life as a very sickly child, a self-described wretched mite, plagued by all sorts of infirmities. In his early years, he was often too weak or unwell to do much other than just stay inside, so he would read about hunting, exploration, and pioneering the wilderness, poring over stories of people who did the things that he couldn't. Teddy's father saw his son's desire, and more importantly, saw potential, and he pushed Teddy to become stronger, instilling a deep sense of willpower. And it paid off because as Teddy grew into a young man, he became stronger both physically and mentally. It's been joked about for years that Roosevelt basically cured himself with asthma by sheer force of will, but that's honestly not too far off. Impossible was not a word in his vocabulary, and if something was humanly attainable, that meant that he could do it if he tried. Mr. Roosevelt Sr. was not just Teddy's father, but one of his most influential teachers, mentors, and best friends growing up, which is really what a father should be anyway. As a well-respected philanthropist in New York, he raised his son to believe that people in positions of wealth and power, especially those who called themselves Christians, are free to enjoy the benefits, but are also obligated to use their status for the good of those without the same wealth and power. Literally, with great power comes great responsibility. Like Spider-Man. Now, Teddy was, of course, still a bit held back by his childhood infirmities, and he still had pretty bad social skills and some latent medical issues like poor eyesight in his early adulthood, and he was not anything close to a party boy in college, although he became a well-studied academic and a pretty decent boxer and wrestler. And despite being upper class, he developed into a humble, charming conversationalist who was genuinely interested in learning about other people and their way of life. And this wasn't so much as a novelty, but more so in a desire to see people as they really were. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. died at 46 of stomach cancer, and Teddy took his father's loss pretty hard. He occupied his mind afterward by traveling to Maine to live with hunters and explorers in the wilderness, where he grew his love, knowledge, and experience with the outdoors. When he returned to New York City, Teddy decided to get involved in politics and joined the Republican Party, with his main goal being to fight for the rights and protections of the lower-class immigrant workers in the city. He quickly made a name for himself as a passionate and charismatic newcomer who was very outspoken against things like political corruption and government interference in private matters. Eventually, he realized that he was becoming so much of a personality that he was losing favor, so he toned it down a bit, and rather than calling out his opponents all the time, he started to seek ways to compromise, becoming an incredibly effective legislator. He began visiting the lower-class areas of New York City so that he could gain a better understanding of what life was like there, so he could fight for change more effectively. The man really wanted to make a difference, but things hit a road bump in 1884. Both Teddy's mother and wife died in his arms on the same day, his mother from typhoid fever and his wife due to kidney failure from complications in childbirth. In his journal entry from that day, all he wrote was a single large X and the sentence, "The light has gone out from my life." It also didn't help that his political career was taking a bit of a hit at the same time, forcing him to make compromises to stay in the party and consequently losing some of his previous supporters. Naturally, all of this was incredibly taxing both mentally and emotionally, and so to process and escape it all for a while, he took a hiatus from politics, put his daughter in the temporary care of his sister, and left New York City to go west. He settled in the Badlands region of South Dakota, where he had plenty of room and time to deal with his grief and stress, while seeking out the adventures and the wilderness that he had dreamed of as a boy. He learned how to ride and shoot, he got into ranching and animal conservation, and he even served as a deputy sheriff in Billings County, North Dakota. When the winter of '86 and '87 killed over half of his cattle, Teddy took it as a sign to wrap things up on the frontier and head back to New York City to get back into politics and to raise his daughter Alice. Around the same time, he married his childhood friend Edith Caro and had several more children with her named Theodore III, Ethel, Archibald, Quentin, and Kermit. Over the next few years, Roosevelt slowly worked his way back into politics, first running for New York City mayor and then joining the United States Civil Service Commission after losing the election. He went on to serve as the New York City Police Commissioner, where he implemented a lot of reform to the department, enforcing things like regular training and inspections, as well as prioritizing the hiring of competent, qualified officers over men with political or social ties. He also cracked down on the enforcement of the Raines Law, which, among other things, prohibited the sale of alcohol on Sundays. And he even attended a protest against the Rain Law once to listen and laugh at the insults being hurled his way, which some of the protesters actually sort of respected him for. In 1897, Teddy was appointed as Assistant Secretary of the Navy by President McKinley, which was pretty much a high-level administrative role for a civilian senior official. Because of this position, Roosevelt had a lot of involvement and input in the lead-up to the Spanish-American War, and he understood the complexity of the situation, but he also believed it was not only in the best interests of the U.S. to drive out the Spanish, but it was also its duty. Our own direct interests were great because of the Cuban tobacco and sugar, and especially because of Cuba's relations to the projected Isthmian Canal, but even greater were our interests from the standpoint of humanity. It was our duty, even more from the standpoint of national honor than from the standpoint of national interest, to stop the devastation and destruction. Because of these considerations, I favored war. When it was decided that the US would indeed go to war, the first immediate issue was getting enough troops. But although there were plenty of men willing to volunteer, there weren't as many available to actually train and lead them. Faced with that predicament, TR said, "Fine, I'll do it myself." With the guidance of U.S. Army Colonel Leonard Wood and his experience with the New York National Guard, Roosevelt got to work finding the right men to serve under him. He traveled throughout the American Southwest looking for men from that region who would already be accustomed to the heat and humidity that they would see while fighting in Cuba, and he recruited hunters, prospectors, and cowboys because he wanted the kind of men that would be comfortable living out in the wilderness and already knew how to shoot and ride a horse. A large percentage of the men that joined were actually Texas Rangers, and as Roosevelt himself said, "We drew a great many recruits from Texas, and from nowhere did we get a higher average, for many of them had served in that famous body of frontier fighters, the Texas Rangers." He also went to various Indian tribes to recruit men who would have experience tracking targets or fighting against a superior force. He gathered up veterans of the Civil War to serve as officers and leaders due to their military experience, and he even visited several different universities to look for some athletic Ivy League boys who needed something to do between semesters. Hey guys, you want to go kill Spanish for the summer? Teddy would gather his volunteers at numerous recruitment hubs in the weeks leading up to the start of training, one of those places being right here in the Menger Hotel in San Antonio, which would later serve as the go-to R&R spot during training. In fact, it was in this very bar in the Menger Hotel that Roosevelt enlisted the men wanting to join this regiment. Now, if you couldn't tell, the Menger is very proud of the role it played in the history of the Rough Riders, and it might also surprise you to know that despite being taken apart, relocated, and rearranged a few times in the last 100 years, most of the bar's original 1887 furnishings are still here today, so all this woodwork and most of the furniture is original. Funnily enough, there's actually a section of the counter here that had to be patched because there was apparently an old lady that was so against alcohol that she would just go around to different bars in town with a hatchet and just started hacking away. There's also a story that Teddy got into a discussion with one of his prospective recruits while here at the bar over who was the better shot, and so they each took turns firing at the woodwork next to the bar with this mirror back here. They wanted to see who could get the closest to the glass without shattering it, and interestingly enough, the bullets are still there. The winning shot is, as you can expect, believed to be Teddy's. When speaking privately with a journalist friend of his named Richard Dickey O'Houlihan, Roosevelt casually voiced his intention to organize a regiment of Rough Riders, referencing the phrase from some of the advertisements for Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. O'Houlihan thought the moniker was perfect for a headline, and the name stuck. Before training even began in May of 1898, the 1st Volunteer Cavalry was already being referred to as the Rough Riders, and it quickly became their name in the public eye. Back then, all you had to do for something as big as signing up for the military was just to give them your name. But nowadays, it seems that something as simple as accessing certain websites requires you to sign your entire life away. And then all of your personal information is just left online for all sorts of people to use for all kinds of purposes without your knowledge or consent. But thankfully, you can put a stop to that with the help of today's sponsor, Aura. Whenever your information ends up online, it's often picked up by data brokers who will sell that information to all sorts of people, and that's why you get spam calls and spam emails and maybe even get your personal information leaked on the dark web. Now, you can track down all these different data brokers and get them to take down your information, but it's very time consuming and very tedious, and that's where Aura comes in. Aura will scrub the internet for your information and issue takedown requests on your behalf. Then once your information is taken down, they'll continue to monitor in case it shows up somewhere else. They also offer a whole host of virtual privacy services such as a VPN, credit monitoring, and up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should something go bad. If you want to get started with a safer internet experience with Aura at a discount, you can use my code BRANDYBUCK at checkout or go to the link in the description for a 14-day free trial, which gives Aura enough time to start scrubbing the internet for your information without you having to do a thing. So let Aura make data leaks and identity theft a piece of history so that you can have greater peace of mind to listen to me talk about some real history right now. When training began, Colonel Woods was able to get equipment and supplies for the men from the Texas Armory, ensuring that they would be just as capable as any other Army unit. While other volunteer units were largely supplied with leftovers and surplus equipment like the older trapdoor rifles that the Army had used in the past, thanks to both Woods and Roosevelt's connections, they were able to arm the men with the current loadout. This included a Colt single-action Army revolver and Krag Jorgenson bolt-action rifle for the regular troops, while the officers were all outfitted with Winchester 1895s chambered in .30 government like the Krags. The 1895 was actually one of Roosevelt's favorite guns, and he owned several of them in various calibers for all of the different hunting that he did. He also had a Smith & Wesson Model 3 revolver that was meant to be his sidearm for the campaign, but ever the man to make a statement, he instead... Oh my gosh, it got super bright all of a sudden. He also had a Smith & Wesson Model 3 revolver that was meant to be his sidearm for the campaign, but ever one to make a statement, he instead carried a Colt 1892 revolver recovered from the wreck of the USS Maine. This Model 3 went on to be Roosevelt's go-to nightstand gun, and it was later sold at auction in 2022 for over $900,000. The Rough Riders also got a little bonus thanks to some wealthy benefactors. 2 Colt Browning M1895 machine guns, often remembered as the Tiffany guns. Now, there's a common misconception that the Tiffany guns were gifted to the Rough Riders by Louis Tiffany of the famous luxury designer brand because his son had joined the regiment. But that's not true. Now, there was a William Tiffany who joined the Rough Riders, and he was a close friend of Roosevelt's, but his father, George, was actually Louis Tiffany's cousin. Now, there was a William Tiffany who did join the Rough Riders, and he was a close friend of Roosevelt's, but his father, George, was actually Louis Tiffany's cousin. Now, George Tiffany had also died about 10 years earlier, so he obviously couldn't have donated 2 machine guns. In reality, William and his sisters pitched in together to pay for one of the guns, and the second was purchased by Sybil and Louisa Kane, sisters of Woodbury Kane, who was a friend of Roosevelt's from Harvard and served as a captain in the Rough Riders. The Colt Browning 1895 is the first gas-operated machine gun to ever see military service, and one of its earliest uses was by the Rough Riders. It's often referred to by its nickname, the potato digger, because of an external lever under the barrel that cycles during fire. If the gun is mounted too low to the ground, that lever will literally dig into the dirt, and that's where it got the name. But despite that goofy mechanism, the potato digger was actually a pretty competent machine gun even by today's standards, and it was an improvement in a lot of ways over the hand-cranked Gatling guns, and a decent competitor to the Maxim machine guns used by the Spanish. Despite being just as equipped and organized as a regular army regiment, Roosevelt still wanted his ragtag group of ruffians to look like a ragtag group of ruffians. So he curated a uniform to match the aesthetic. The uniform was a slouch hat, a blue flannel shirt, brown trousers and leggings, and boots with a handkerchief knotted loosely around the neck. They looked exactly as a body of a cowboy cavalry should look. When training began at Riverside Park south of San Antonio, Roosevelt welcomed members of the press to come photograph and document everything, seeing the potential of good publicity. Not only would it help make the Rough Riders gain more favor in the public eye, but it would also help prove that Roosevelt himself wasn't just some businessman and city boy trying to play dress up. There wasn't a whole lot of time to get the men ready, so training was simple and basic, but thorough. Most, if not all of the men already knew how to use a gun and ride a horse, so the bulk of it was mostly just practicing drills and learning how to operate as a unit. Since they were so effective with their rifles and revolvers, it was decided that learning to fight with a saber on horseback wasn't really necessary, which at the time was highly irregular for a cavalry. When they weren't practicing out on the field, Roosevelt heavily encouraged both officers and the regular soldiers to read books on war tactics and strategies so that there was little waste of time. On May 29th, the men were put on a train and taken down to a staging area in Tampa, where preparations were made to get the men across the Caribbean over to Cuba. The U.S. government really wanted to get things moving, so General William Shafter rushed preparations and ordered the men shipped out before things were completely ready. This meant that there wasn't enough time or room to get all of the Rough Riders over to Cuba, and there certainly wasn't enough room to ship all of the horses over with them. So that means that all of those super famous pictures of Roosevelt leading the charge with a bunch of men holding swords on horseback, not true. This understandably threw a huge wrench into the plan and caused a lot of frustration with Roosevelt and a dip in morale for the men. However, there wasn't really anything anyone could do about it, and ultimately, only 8 of the Rough Riders' 12 companies were permitted to leave Tampa, and only a handful of horses were allowed to go with them for use by some of the officers. This meant that the 1st Volunteer Cavalry was now marching and fighting as regular infantry, meaning that they were grossly unprepared for what they were about to do. They arrived on the shores of Cuba on June 23rd when they linked up with the 1st and 10th Regular Cavalries. The 1st Cavalry, also known as the Dragoons, were more or less the Army Regular equivalent to the Rough Riders, with the main difference being that the men were full-trained, long-term soldiers, unlike the temporary volunteers that made up the Rough Riders. The 10th Cavalry was an all-black regiment, often referred to as the Buffalo Soldiers, so named because the Plains tribes from the Indian Wars a few years earlier thought that their hair and skin color resembled the fur of a buffalo, and their tough fighting spirit reflected the resilience of the animals as well. Also, it's not necessarily an insult to call the men of the 10th Buffalo Soldiers, since they embraced the nickname, and they even used the image of a buffalo in the regiment's insignia. They also enlisted just like regular soldiers of any white regiment, and they were also trained, equipped, and played exactly the same, even though they definitely weren't treated the same by everyone, and they were certainly discriminated against and taken advantage of at times. But for what it's worth, Roosevelt spoke quite highly of the Buffalo Soldiers, and he would praise them repeatedly for their bravery and honor in his writings after the Spanish-American War. Within a day of arriving to Cuba, the Rough Riders were already being sent out for their recon missions, and they reported on a Spanish outpost in Las Guasimas. That very afternoon, General Leonard Wood gave the order to advance towards the area, and the entire group of soldiers set up a very crude camp a ways off from the Spanish outpost, with plans to attack in the morning. The problem was, the Spanish expected this attack to happen and had already prepared defenses and made predictions on what positions the Americans would take and where they were most likely to advance from. It also didn't help that the surrounding area was thick jungle that was very hard to navigate and see through for the Americans, while the Spanish had been around long enough to know their way around. Thirdly, the Spanish were also armed with the new Spanish 1893 Mauser rifles that shot smokeless powder, which meant that the direction of fire wasn't as immediately noticeable since there wasn't a huge plume of smoke to give up their position. This, of course, wasn't the only advantage to these Mausers, and in fact, the Spanish-American War ended up being the very reason that the US military phased out the Krag rifles before World War I, but we'll get into that in another video. The shooting started at Las Guasimas with an American bombardment from Hotchkiss artillery guns under the order of General Samuel Young. The troops slowly moved forward under the covering fire, but were outnumbered by the Spanish forces, who were able to hold them back for a while. However, the thick vegetation and topography provided both an advantage and disadvantage to both sides, in that while it was hard to see the enemy, it was also hard for the enemy to see them, and this allowed Roosevelt to split the Rough Riders into two groups and circle around the battlefield to flank the Spanish while everyone else made their way up the center. One of the other commanders during the battle was General Joseph Wheeler, or Fightin' Joe, played by Mr. Buttered Sausage himself in the 1997 miniseries. Now, he had been formerly a commander in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, and at one point during the Battle of Las Guasimas, he was trying to rally his men for a charge and had a bit of a flashback, accidentally saying, "Let's go, boys, we've got those damn Yankees on the run again." And remember that the soldiers there were mixed company, an entire regiment of which were former slaves, and many more were veterans of the Civil War themselves from both sides, so I'm sure that was a little awkward. There was also a journalist named Edward Marshall on site at the battle, and in fact the Spanish-American War would end up being one of the first US conflicts to be heavily covered by journalists and photographers on ground, thanks to the rise of yellow journalism and advances in photographic technology. At one point in the battle, Marshall actually picked up a gun himself and began fighting before catching a bullet to the spine. One of the American soldiers saw him go down and mistook him for Colonel Wood, assuming that he had been shot dead, and although both Wood and Marshall ended up surviving the battle, it was initially reported to Roosevelt that Wood had been killed, at which time he assumed full command over the men around him. The fighting came to a stop in just a few hours, with the Spanish retreating towards Santiago and the American forces taking control of Las Guasimas. And once everything died down, Wood walked back up to Roosevelt, very much surprised to see him very much still alive.
I thought you were dead.
My death was greatly exaggerated.
Although it wasn't really a super impactful battle, the fighting at Las Guasimas was still important as one of the earliest conflicts on the ground during the Spanish-American War, as well as the first time that the Rough Riders saw any combat. It also served as a great example of the kind of fighting conditions the American forces could expect moving forward. The American troops set up camp at Las Guasimas, where they spent the next 6 days resting, recouping, bringing in more supplies, and tending to the dead and wounded. During the pause in the fighting, General Wheeler came down with a debilitating fever, and while he was still in charge of volunteer divisions in Cuba, he was too sick to command the men on the field, leaving General Samuel Sumner in place and Colonel Wood as acting Brigadier General, meaning that Roosevelt was now Colonel of the Rough Riders. In preparation for the upcoming battle, the American troops were split into two different divisions, one led by General Jacob Kent and made up of 3 brigades, and the second under the command of Sumner, made up of 2 brigades, one of which contained the Buffalo Soldiers, the Dragoons, and the Rough Riders. The American troops soon got the order to move forward towards another Spanish outpost at San Juan Heights on July 1st, which coincidentally is the same day that I filmed a big chunk of this video back during the summer, in the very place that the Rough Riders trained for preparation of this battle that took place on the day that I filmed it. Definitely not a coincidence. The idea was the same as the battle that they just fought at Las Guasimas, with the Rough Riders forcing the Spanish to hold their ground while the American artillery hit their position. Now, something that the US did not know during the Battle of Las Guasimas was that the Spanish not only planned for this battle to happen, but they intended to retreat from the very beginning. Their goal in fighting at Las Guasimas was not simply to hold the Americans back, it was actually to delay them long enough for the larger forces waiting at San Juan Heights to prepare for a large fight that was about to happen. So, San Juan Heights is an elevated area just outside of Santiago made up of 2 different hills separated by a small valley with a river running through. One hill had an old sugar refinery on top, earning it the name of Kettle Hill, and the other was San Juan Hill, where the majority of the Spanish forces were embedded. To get a better idea of what the upcoming battlefield was going to look like, some men of the American Signal Corps got into a hot air balloon to survey the area, which was an insanely stupid idea since it told the Spanish what direction the Americans would be coming from, and also gave them an excellent target to start shooting at. And sure enough, when the initial group of American forces made it past the tree line and into the valley, Colonel Charles Wilcoff of the 1st Division's 3rd Brigade was shot almost immediately. Lieutenant Colonel William Worth then took up the lead until he was shot 5 minutes later, leaving command to Lieutenant Colonel Emerson Liscombe, who was also shot within a few minutes. This left Lieutenant Colonel Ezra Ewers in charge of that particular group of men, having been by necessity promoted up from 4th in command in less than half an hour. While the 1st Division was making their way towards San Juan Hill, the Rough Riders and most of the 2nd Division were caught up in the middle of the valley, forcing them to slowly inch their way towards the base of Kettle Hill. The start of the battle was, as you can probably tell, very rushed, meaning that Roosevelt and the Rough Riders didn't really have a lot of time to do proper recon and come up with a good plan, which was something that Roosevelt was understandably very frustrated about. He was able to send a few messengers back to ask for support, and in a short time, they were joined by more regulars, mostly made up of the Buffalo Soldiers. I should also note that at this point, Roosevelt was actually mounted on his horse, Little Texas, who was one of the few horses allowed to come over with the men from Tampa. Now, Roosevelt had not been able to ride Little Texas at Las Guasimas due to the nature of the fighting and the landscape, but the wider area and larger dispersal of men at San Juan Heights meant that riding back and forth on horseback was the best way for Roosevelt to command his men. As they made their way to the base of Kettle Hill, Roosevelt realized that the heavy fire from the Spanish up top meant that this slow creep upward wasn't sustainable and that a mass charge was their best chance to overtake the Spanish. So while the men held their position, he rode back to the platoon captain and said, "Look, either we all charge together right now, or we're just going to keep losing men and we won't be able to take Kettle Hill." To which the captain said, "Well, the orders I have from my colonel are to hold position, so we can't do that." And then Roosevelt, in trademark fashion, goes, "Well, I see no other colonel out here but me, so we're going." And then he charges ahead on Little Texas, rallies the men to push up the hill. The Rough Riders followed him basically without hesitation, which inspires many of the other soldiers there to jump in as well. And as they all charge up towards the top of Kettle Hill, Roosevelt looks back to the men and goes, "If any of you turn around right now and run, I'll shoot you myself when this is over, and I'm a man of my word," and then took off ahead of them. And then the Rough Riders say to all the other men, "Oh, you know, that's just old TR. He's such a jokester. He says that all the time. He's kidding." Once they made their way up Kettle Hill, the American soldiers were given cover fire by 3 nearby Gatling guns under the command of Lieutenant John Parker, which allowed enough soldiers to climb up in a series of short rushes. There suddenly smote on our ears a peculiar drumming sound. 1 or 2 of the men cried out, "It's the Spanish machine guns," but after listening a moment, I leapt to my feet and called, "It's the Gatlings, men! Our Gatlings!" And immediately the troopers began to cheer lustily, for the sound was most inspiring. As they reached the summit, Roosevelt rode into a placement of barbed wire, forcing him to dismount Little Texas and fight the rest of the way on foot. But don't worry, the horse was fine, and in fact he remained in Roosevelt's ownership after the war and lived comfortably at the Roosevelt estate in New York until his death in 1903, when he was buried in the family cemetery with many more of their beloved animals. In only about 20 minutes, Roosevelt and his men took Kettle Hill, and the Spanish began concentrating their fire in that direction, allowing the rest of the American troops to charge up the other hill. And seeing that the work was done, Roosevelt called for his men to charge back across the valley and support the men at San Juan Hill, to which only like 5 guys went with him at first because everyone else apparently didn't hear him. Within the next hour, the Spanish were driven out of San Juan Heights, and it's been largely agreed that had Lieutenant Parker not supported the rush to the top of Kettle Hill with the Gatling gun emplacement, that the Rough Riders wouldn't have been able to make it up to the top, and the Spanish could have very well won that entire battle, and, by extension, possibly all of Cuba. I think Parker deserved rather more credit than any other one man in the entire campaign. He had the rare good judgment and foresight to see the possibilities of machine guns. He then, by his own exertions, got it to the front and proved that it could do invaluable work on the field of battle, as much as in attacks as in defense. The Americans figured a Spanish counterattack couldn't be too far off, so Parker's Gatlings were distributed to both hills, and when the force of around 600 Spanish tried to retake Kettle Hill, the Gatling guns cut down all but 40 of them. Witnessing Parker's effectiveness at commanding the machine guns, Roosevelt decided that the Rough Riders' 2 Colt Brownings would be better put to use under his command, and he gave them over. Once all the dust and smoke settled, Roosevelt gathered the men on top of the hill and requested photojournalist William Dunwoody to take the now famous picture of Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and some of the dragoons and Buffalo soldiers posing for the victory. Although the American forces lost twice as many men in battle than the Spanish, victory at San Juan Heights marked the beginning of the end for the fighting in Cuba, and while the city of Santiago would lay under siege for the next few days, a treaty of capitulation was eventually reached with the Spanish, who left the city on July 17th. General Wood later installed Emilio Bacardi as the new mayor of Santiago, and the rum mogul went on to serve as a very effective and well-regarded leader for the next few years, even winning a seat in the Cuban Senate. Now, according to a notarized affidavit from Bacardi, the company's future advertising executive, Fausto Rodriguez, had been working with the American occupational forces in 1900 as an assistant to the Signal Corps. And as the story goes, Rodriguez was at a local bar in Havana with some American troops when the captain he served under ordered a glass of rum mixed with Coca-Cola, which had just made its way over from the mainland. Several other patrons were intrigued and tried the drink for themselves, and the modern Cuba Libre as we know it today was born. Following the siege of Santiago, the Spanish-American War would continue until mid-August in places like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, but the Rough Riders had done their job, and so they went home. Aside from the obvious wartime killer of bullets, one of the biggest hurdles the men had to overcome was disease, and by the time the war ended, more American troops had actually died from malaria, typhoid, and yellow fever than any who were lost in combat. Lieutenant William Tiffany would die shortly after returning home from a combination of yellow fever and malnutrition, and Roosevelt remembered him as one of the most gallant and efficient officers they had, a man of dauntless courage and absorbed attention to duty. The surviving Rough Riders gathered in Montauk on August 14th, where they were reunited with the rest of the men and horses that had been left behind in Tampa. Roosevelt did not look down on the men who didn't go to fight, even writing later that those who stayed had done their duty precisely as did those who went, for the question of glory was not to be considered in comparison to the faithful performance of whatever was ordered. Over the next month, everyone rested, healed up, and celebrated their victory and returned home. To thank Roosevelt for his leadership, everyone pitched in to present him with a casting of the famous Bronco Buster statue to show their thanks, and in Roosevelt's own words, there could have been no more appropriate gift from such a regiment. When the Rough Riders were officially disbanded, every single man in the regiment lined up to shake Roosevelt's hand and pay their respects. His actions as leader of the 1st Volunteer Cavalry Division would earn Roosevelt a Congressional Medal of Honor recommendation. However, it was denied him due to some stupid political drama and wouldn't be officially awarded to him until 2001, making him the first and only president to receive the award. When everyone went home, Roosevelt reminded them that the fighting may have been over, but the world was still turning and life had to go on. Many men integrated back into civilian life, but plenty more were either too sick or too injured to return to the life they knew. Roosevelt would later reflect on his time in Cuba as a splendid little war, even though his entire total combat experience spanned the grand total of just 2 days. However, the victory at San Juan Hill was instrumental in gaining Roosevelt more favor in the public eye nationwide, and is largely responsible for winning him the presidential election in 1901. One of his main campaign points was giving official statehood to Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma to honor the men from those territories who had served under him. The surviving men of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry would have yearly reunions in Las Vegas all the way until 1967, when the last and only man to attend was Jesse Langdon, who had hoboed his way from the Dakota Territory all the way to Washington at just 16 years old to join the Rough Riders. According to Langdon, when he arrived at the Capitol, he actually ran into Roosevelt on a stairway completely by coincidence and became a little starstruck and blurted out, "You're Theodore Roosevelt!" And Roosevelt said, "Sure am, what can I do for you?" To which Langdon replied, "Well, I just bummed my way across half the country to come fight with you." And all Roosevelt asked was, "Well, can you ride a horse?" I know being Langdon's own account, it might be a little embellished, who knows, but you can't tell me that this entire exchange doesn't feel straight out of a movie. There is a little spider dude doing his thing right here. Super cool. I don't know if you can see, but there's a little guy right here. Oh, and he fell. Okay. While September 15th, 1898 marked the official date of the Rough Riders' disbandment, many of the soldiers who made up the ranks would end up fighting in World War I, and Roosevelt himself would even attempt to basically do Rough Riders Part 2 in 1917 to send a group of volunteer soldiers to France. He got so far as to assemble officers and begun campaigning for recruits, but Woodrow Wilson ultimately struck down the idea and Roosevelt dropped it. Now, even though the entire lifespan was only a few months and their active service added up to a grand total of about 37 days, the Rough Riders have secured their place as an icon of American military history. They weren't just soldiers, they were cowboys, hunters, lawmen, athletes, and native scouts. A great big melting pot of men from all walks of life coming together to fight for what they thought was right. And at the end of the day, that's what America's really all about. Now, there's always going to be controversy in warfare, especially in terms of foreign policy, and even though the Spanish-American War was kind of the start of the US being the world's police force, it was also the nation's first real opportunity to prove itself on the world stage. As you might know, leading the Rough Riders was just one of many crazy shenanigans Roosevelt got up to in his life, and some of his other escapades may be worth their own video in the future. That said, thank you for sticking around for this video, and if you made it all the way to the end, then I can assume that you enjoy my long-winded dissertations on interesting bits of history, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I know I'm just coming off of the Weird Gun Iceberg series, but I have a lot of ideas for other videos about fun stories from history and my own perspectives on different works of fiction, so if that sounds interesting, make sure to stick around. And if you enjoy my hyperfixation rants about firearms, then I also just launched a second channel called Brandy Buckshot, which will focus exclusively on gun-related content, and the first video there should be coming out the exact same time as this video that you're watching right now, taking an in-depth look at the rivalry between the Krag Jorgenson rifles used by the Rough Riders and the Spanish Mausers used by the Spanish. So if that sounds interesting, I'll see you over there too. I want to thank you all for watching, and I also want to give a huge thanks to the Menger Hotel in San Antonio for letting me come out and film on property. It was an amazing opportunity to talk about the history of the Rough Riders in some of the same places that history took place, and hopefully you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Goodbye, everyone.